In this video, we're going to talk about the issue I had with my Allison B500 on my recent trip, which ended up being a defective connector, which I ended up solving with a 10-cent butt connector. This video is going to be something of a post-mortem because I didn't record anything while this was happening on my recent trip. Hopefully this is not some information that you ever need, but the general techniques that I go over and some of the things that I learned may prove useful to you in the future if you have an issue with your Allison. First, I want to talk through what happened and what the symptoms were because they were very atypical and not like something that anybody that I talked to in this whole process had ever seen before. These issues happened on I-70 as I was heading towards Denver. The first thing I noticed was that my cruise control was behaving rather erratically. I had it set at a certain speed, and rather than maintaining a fairly constant throttle, this was a level road with not much else going on, it was very clearly jumping up and down in power, and when I looked at my instrument cluster, I noticed that my speedometer was starting to behave erratically and jump all over the place. The transmission was in 6th gear in lockup, and nothing was behaving erratically as far as engine behavior was concerned, but the speedometer was very clearly not behaving correctly. If you ever driven I-70 in eastern Colorado, there's not a whole lot out there, and so I didn't want to stop knowing that there was a potential problem and not really knowing what the failure modes could be. So since everything otherwise seemed to be behaving correctly, I kept on going. Eventually the speedometer did settle on 0, but the engine and transmission were still behaving fine in 6th gear lockup. At one point I manually downshifted to 5th gear, that seemed to work. I shifted back up to 6th gear, that seemed to work as well, and everything was going relatively okay. Eventually I did stop for a reason unrelated to the transmission. I wanted to check something on my Jeep that I tow behind the Prevost, and after that what ended up happening was the transmission seemed to be stuck in 2nd gear, torque converter not locked up. This created more of a problem for 2 reasons. The first reason being that in 2nd gear I'm not going to be able to go very quickly, and I still had about 70 miles to get to Denver. The second reason being, though, that at this point the transmission had stopped communicating with the engine and the rest of the display, and so I didn't know what my transmission temperature was going to be. When the torque converter is unlocked on a transmission, it's going to generate a whole lot more heat than when it's locked. On the Allison, the torque converter is locked up virtually all the time once you get moving. I ended up limping about another 15 or 20 miles to the next town and ended up stopping at a gas station and parking there to investigate further. At this point I realized I was going to have to figure out and fix whatever was going on with this before I kept on going. I shut off the bus, and upon restarting it, the transmission would not go into any gear and would not move at all. One of the things that I want to point out that was very unusual was that my transmission shift pad was either not indicating anything whatsoever other than the mode light being on, or it was indicating the number 0 on the gear indicator. This ended up being something that nobody that I talked to in the subsequent hours had ever seen before, and it kind of makes sense when we get to what ended up being the problem. At this point I'd like to stop for a second and acknowledge what a great community we have within the Prevost owners group, and then also thank everybody who helped me in the subsequent hours after this happened. Almost immediately I went onto the various Prevost Facebook groups that I'm on, posting my issue and hoping that somebody had seen this before and would have some suggestions. Responses started coming in very quickly, both in suggestions of things to check and then also suggestions of people to call who may be able to help out with things. The next phone call that I made was to Prevost Pass, which is their 24-hour technical support line where you can talk to a real Prevost mechanic who works on these buses and get some help on what the issue might be. In the end, this Prevost mechanic spent about 3 hours on the phone with me. Prevost doesn't charge for this service. This particular mechanic had not spent a whole lot of time working on this era of bus, but he was able to help me decipher the Prevost wiring diagrams and give me some ideas for things that I should check to figure out what exactly was going on. Another nice feature of this is that the Prevost Pass mechanics all are able to talk to each other and able to use their communal knowledge to help find out what might be going on with your bus if it's a particularly difficult issue. However, the person who helped the most with all of this, and this was a suggestion that I got from the Prevost group, was to call Alan from Precision Prevost. Precision Prevost is an independent Prevost shop, and Alan has been working on these buses literally since before I was born. He spent about an hour and a half on the phone with me trying to diagnose the issue, and in the process, not only did he help me figure out the things that I should be looking for, but he also taught me a lot of things about this bus that I didn't know about at all. I ended up coming away from my conversation with him with a bunch of notes of other things that I should put on the list to work on in the future, and I'll do some of those in upcoming videos. Check out Precision Prevost in the Denver area if you need some work done on your Prevost. Now let's get back into some of the things that we did for testing. The Prevost wiring diagrams are freely available on their website, which is something that everybody should have bookmarked on their phone and on their computer if you own one of these. You don't need a specific login, all you need is your bus VIN, and you can go online, you can get any wiring diagrams that you need. Admittedly, these wiring diagrams can be very complicated and a little bit confusing if you're not used to reading these things, and that's one of the areas where the Prevost Pass representatives helped me quite a bit. I don't know how many miles of wiring are in this bus, but it's got to be significant. And so one of the things that you also have to be aware of is that sometimes wiring diagrams will then reference other wiring diagrams because everything is somehow connected on these vehicles. Another tool that I didn't have with me at the time and I ended up having to run to the next town to buy was a multimeter. I'll put a link in the description to a multimeter that you can buy off of Amazon, but this is something that you should keep in your Prevost at all times. Prevosts have complicated electrical systems, but a lot of times the electrical problems are actually pretty easy to solve. But if you don't have a basic multimeter, you're still not going to be able to find where the issue may lie. Once I had the multimeter and I had an understanding of where to check on the wiring diagrams, I started looking at various connections that may prove to be problematic. There are a lot of connectors and there are a lot of wires, and they're all marked with various numbers to identify which is which. Every single wire in this bus actually has a marking on it so that you can tell which one it is on the wiring diagram, and that helps quite a bit. As I went through the diagnostics, the first thing I checked were the fuses up here. Those were fine. I checked circuit breakers both up here and then also in the back of the bus. While I was tracing the power and the grounds, what I started off doing was I went from the back of the bus and then I worked my way forward. That way I could try to tell where within the line there was a problem. And I ended up finding that the grounds were fine and I found the power was fine all the way up here. And then eventually what I did was I got the connectors off of the transmission control unit, which is this box here. What I ended up finding was that the transmission control computer did have power, but what it did not have was a good ground. When I checked the resistance for the pins for ground on the wiring harness, they ended up having a resistance of anywhere from about 200 to 800 ohms. The correct resistance for a ground wire is going to be 0 ohms to ground, so this told me that I probably had a ground issue. So at that point, I started looking backwards from the wiring harness to see where there were potential connections that could be bad. What I ended up finding was a connector C29, which is located right here, or it was located right here. And that is a single wire connector that is there for some reason, probably just has to do with how the various wiring harnesses were produced. It has one pin on one side, one pin on the other side, and it just connects the ground wire for the transmission computer to the rest of the harness where it ultimately gets a ground. And that was this connector. When I started to try to take it apart, it seemed very stuck, and that gave me an indication that I was probably on the right track. And when I pulled it off, I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see, but you can see this pin here, which is the only pin that's in use, was damaged. And you're not going to be able to see in here, I don't think, but it's damaged on this side as well, and it has what looks to be a bent pin. So somewhere along the line, what ended up happening was this connector got put together incorrectly, the pin got bent, and in the end this wasn't making a good connection. You might be asking why this even worked at all if it was like that, and I'm not 100% sure, but sometimes what can happen with electronics is that they can find an alternate ground through the case, through somewhere else in the wiring harness, and they can get enough of a ground to work properly. And I think that may be what ended up happening here. Note that when I did check the resistance for the wiring harness to ground, it was showing somewhere in that 200 to 800 ohm range. So it was getting some kind of a grounding signal somewhere, and it might have just been borderline enough to make the ECU work. It's also possible that it had a bad connection, but it was getting a better ground signal, and then because it had a bad connection, it may have been heating up over time and eventually melted or otherwise come apart to the point where it was no longer making a solid connection, and that was causing my issue. I certainly can't definitively say one way or the other. I hope you found this video interesting. Hopefully you will never find it useful. This was really an unpleasant item to have to diagnose, but I also really lucked out. If the transmission controller had gone bad, if the transmission itself had gone bad, not only would I have been looking at something that was a whole lot more expensive and would have completely canceled the rest of the trip, it also would have made things take a whole lot longer. It was just very fortunate that it was just this simple connector. Still, the diagnostic process can apply to a lot of things, and oftentimes when you go through and try to figure out what exactly is going on, it's not what you would expect. But again, I also want to thank everybody who was willing to help when I had this issue. Alan at Precision Prevost, he was up very late trying to help me on the phone with items. People on Facebook on the Prevost groups were responding and offering help and suggestions as well. When situations like this occur, they're never pleasant, but then seeing how good of a community we have and how everybody's willing to reach out and help one another is something that makes you feel good, both about the community that you're part of and the vehicle that you own. Leave any questions in the comment section down below, and as always, thanks for watching.